Welcome, champions, to the first in my series of diving even deeper into a single champion and dissecting what a formation designed for them looks like, and going into detail about why it works. Covering formations has been by far the most requested topic after my tier lists. So here we are. I was initially thinking of making a one-stop shop guide incorporating everything. You know, all the top DPS and some other niche formations, but that was looking like it would get a tad bit too girthy for a single video and might be a tad messy. Though now breaking them down one by one might make these upcoming videos a bit on the shorter side, but I still think it's for the better. So then the question became where to start. I landed here on Artemis because he is currently considered the best DPS, the meta, the GOAT. My current plan is to at least cover the top 4 DPS and some other formation types, like speed, maybe rehashing Azaka gold farming, even though I technically already covered that in my C12 video, maybe revisiting Jimothy, we'll see. But if there's anything in particular you want to see from a formation point of view, please let me know in the comments. So, Artemis. Some people love him, some people hate him, but you simply cannot deny his potential damage output. Something else you cannot deny, and something I personally find incredibly important if you're going to invest heaps of blacksmithing contracts and leveled legendaries into someone, is his availability. Naturally, without any feats required, he can be used for all 4 patrons and all day 1 trials of Mount Tiamat restrictions, and most restrictions from then on, but there are a few that can bite him in the later days. I've covered his kit in my Seat 3 video, but as a reminder, his bread and butter is Observance, which copies and increases the effect of positional formation abilities from other DPS champions. His jeweled power makes him potentially deal more damage after he kills an enemy, and his ultimate will increase his damage output for 30 seconds based on how many DPS are slotted in the formation. And his attack cooldown recovers every time one of those DPS champions attacks for the duration. He particularly scales well with blacksmithing contracts because not only is his gear slot for Observance one of the best scaling abilities in the game, every slot effectively increases his damage. There isn't really a wasted slot here, as his ultimate just increases his damage output. And if you're looking for a priority on what gear to shiny first with Artemis, there is no question at all that you should start with the gear slot tied to Observance. By far the most important. The rest, and this is based on my personal opinion, is fairly equal, though the last 2 you should focus on is the increased to jeweled power, as I don't think relying on kill mechanics is ideal, and his ultimate cooldown reduction last. Even though in this case it does mean increased uptime on his ultimate, which is in fact more damage sustained, but it's far less impactful than just raw numbers. Now when it comes to feats, he's actually a bit lackluster. He has a few raw damage increases, which is sadly probably the best to slot. The 240% increase should be taken if you have no healing or shielding going out. But if you're actively using Briv, Briv's healing directly conflicts with this on that 10-second timer. The increases to jeweled power are good in an ideal world. Again, personal thing, I hate relying on kill mechanics, as there are some situations where they simply will not be active. There really isn't ever a reason to take the gold increase. It's always kind of confused me honestly why he even has it. I know Artemis will probably never get some love, and that's understandable because he's already so damn strong, but if there ever was something to make him at least a little more interesting, it's in his feats. Now the biggest downside to Artemis is that he absolutely needs that investment to start taking off. His bare bones damage output is akin to that of a wet noodle, but once he takes off he just keeps on soaring. Well, and the fact that his ideal formation is by nature very restrictive, so when you are hit by other restrictions like from variants, he does take a hit, but he still performs. That restrictive formation for Artie requires a very unique brand of champion to be able to scale his damage through Observance, where he takes those positional formation abilities from other DPS champions. So we need to grab as many DPS as we can that also have a positional formation ability. Let's go over who those are. In Seat 1 we have the Nerds, a very interesting pairing with Artemis. You're going to want to shake them up until you have green, red, and orange. This will offer you 3 different supports and make the nerds tank viable. Green, the Bard, increases the damage of those adjacent to them, so you want to try to get some DPS adjacent to observe it from. But Orange, the Fighter, requires the nerds to be taking damage, as orange increases the damage of everyone behind them while they are under attack, which is the more important buff between the two, as it will be applied to everyone behind them, not just adjacent, therefore offering better scaling via observance. 2 positional formation abilities from 1 champion is pretty nice for Artie. And we take Red, the Ranger, as the 3rd, as it's the only other from the nerds that offers a damage increase. But in this case, it is a debuff, so not a positional, but more damage is more damage. There are some instances where you don't necessarily need the nerds in the front line to proc Orange's buff if AoE damage is being dealt to your formation. Like, for example, with some of the bosses in Trials of Mount Tiamat. You can use these encounters in a run to spike your bud and potentially pop a Fire Breath potion. But if you can't set up the nerds where they are taking damage to proc Orange's buff, the nerds likely won't be worth slotting at all. They do have one massive downside, in that they are not available for any patron, but they will be usable for many trials restrictions. With Seed 2 we have Krydle. While he's not the best buffer, he is still a DPS and positional buffer with From the Shadows, where all of the champions in the back 2 columns receive the buff. But be sure Krydle himself is in those back 2 columns if possible. He will quadruple the buff on those from the heroes of Baldur's Gate, including himself, which helps scale it even higher with observance. His charismatic leader is completely wasted here, unfortunately, as Artemis's charisma is in that bracket where he won't receive it. He's still decent, but there is someone else in Seat 2 that is liable to pack a harder punch, but we'll get to that in a second. We now have Kent in Seat 4, and he's just rock solid for Artie. Tokens of the Departed will affect everyone in Kent's column, so make sure you have the maximum amount of other DPS to observe from in the same column as him to maximize the observance output. He also offers Extra, which isn't positional, but like red nerds, damage is damage, baby. Through his ultimate and specialization choice, he offers some great bud damage options as well. And since Artemis's kit is great for spiking your bud, this will grant some extra boosts to your clearing speed. Dhadius in Seat 5 technically counts, but I'm personally not an advocate for using him with Artemis. There are 2 other champions you're liable to use in Seat 5, and while Dhadius is a DPS with a positional formation ability, it's rather weak. He increases the damage of those with an intelligence of 14 or higher. But the only other DPS in the game that could potentially synergize with this are Catti-brie and Makos. Hey, mid-editing Tyredack here. I usually rely on text for stuff like this, but it was a big enough flub I wanted to put a more vocal input on it. Until I was editing, I had completely forgotten that Kent also has enough int to qualify for skill empowerment as well, so Dhadius actually fits in better than he used to. I'd still recommend the others in Seat 5, but he certainly is better than he used to be. One of the champions in this seat he competes with is Briv, who is a great tank that works well with an Artemis team, as he buffs everyone behind him, great for observance scaling. And the other one from Seat 5 we'll get to in a second. Speaking of Catti-brie, we have her in Seat 7. She works great with Artemis, for a few reasons. As her positional affects everyone in front of her, so as long as she's hanging out in the back, you can get it on a lot of other DPS to observe. But she's also tied with Artie in one of his specialization choices, which, let's rehash that right now. He chooses between either increasing Observance's effect by 10% multiplicatively of positional formation abilities observed from champions adjacent to him, or by 25% multiplicatively for positionals observed from Catti-brie and Drizzt. So your choice comes down to who he ends up being adjacent to, once you've set up the rest of your formation, and who between his adjacencies or Catti is the higher percent. Which you pick is entirely up to the circumstance of your slotted formation. Moving on to Seat 9, we have 2 champions, Makos and Birdsong. Makos is a great starter, being a core champion with great availability and simple to slot as he buffs everyone not adjacent to him. And of course, this is assuming you take his second specialization choice. But Birdsong is likely to give better output, and is equally simple to slot, as she buffs everyone within 2 slots of her, and most formations will have a nice spot for her to reach all of your DPS. Just remember to always take her evil specialization choice for Artie, as this bonus happens after observance. There is Orisha in seat 11, who increases the damage of those adjacent to her, and Zorbu in seat 12 who does the same. But for Zorbu, only if they have a dexterity of 15 or higher, so be sure he's adjacent to as many as he can within that threshold. But thankfully, unlike Dhadius, there are plenty of choices for that with Artemis's roster. You'll often hear me say Zorbu is a great place to start if you're interested in a Artemis formation in the future. Zorbu himself is in that top 4 DPS category, and since he's good for an Artemis formation, any blacksmithing contracts or legendaries you've invested in him will carry over and still be useful for Artie. But Zorbu's viability as a DPS comes online much faster than Artemis's, so he might be a better place to start. We'll go deeper into Zorbu in another video though. Now, there are a few more things to cover when talking about champions that are good with Artemis. Ideally, you want a DPS with a positional formation ability. Ideally. But sometimes those champions just don't quite stack up when compared with others. Or in a pinch when you're hit with restrictions, there are some other DPS who don't have positional formation abilities that are still useful. One of those is Nrakk in seed 8, who doesn't have a positional formation ability to offer, but he will buff the abilities of those adjacent to him with a wisdom of 14 or higher, while also being a DPS, of which Orisha and Zorbu qualify. So if he's adjacent to both of them, he will boost both of their positionals, while also receiving them to further scale via observance. Though even with this, Nrakk is overshadowed by many others. Another decent DPS support that is not positional to mention is Torogar. As long as you farmed him up, he is a great buffer for evil champions, which Artemis is, while being a DPS. And an honorable mention to Yorven, sharing a seat with Torogar, who if you set to enough adjacent allies, 3 to 4 ideally, will make Artemis a viable tank. But his buffing doesn't really synergize with Artemis. Now that doesn't mean DPS champions exclusively are always the best in slot for Artie. Sometimes getting a really great buff from another champion and making that buff land on as many DPS as you can is far more dominant. There are 4 big names to mention here. Let's start with Nova, who shares seat 11 with Orisha. If she takes her first specialization, which makes her positional formation ability, the Crew, reach 3 slots as well as 2. The 2 slot and 3 slot variations technically separate buffs. As long as there are DPS to observe from, reaching each variation, he will receive it twice. And it's already one of the best scaling buffs in the game, so this is huge. And certainly outweighs using Orisha's lesser buffing, even without Nova being a DPS. As an aside, you can achieve this with other DPS champions as well, other than Artemis, but that requires using Valentine. As she shares buffs she is receiving to DPS champions. So if you make sure Valentine is receiving the opposite of your DPS between the 2 and 3 slot variations, she will grant the second one to your DPS. Though that does not mean Valentine is worthless for Artemis, as she's the second one we're going to be talking about, and the other sharing seat 5 with Dhadius and Briv. She is not a DPS, and she does not have a positional formation ability. But what she does do is increase the potency of other positional formation abilities she is receiving with Socialite. Technically, Socialite also allows her to give positional formation abilities she is receiving to DPS champions who are not already receiving it. But know that this happens after observance. That means Artemis first sees what positional formation abilities are affecting DPS before Socialite spreads them, so you cannot rely on that. But he still gains the scaling aspect. Eventually, she is really good for Artemis because of that, but it requires a lot of investment in her. And remember, she needs to be receiving every single formation ability herself to be able to scale it. For example, she's not great for me because I haven't invested in her yet, whereas I have in Briv because he's my baby. And using her over him is a massive DPS loss in my personal situation. But if Briv and Valentine were at the same level of investment, she would be outperforming him, and I plan to invest in her in the future. Another consideration is Blooshi over Krydle in Seat 2, as her buff scales incredibly high, and she can place it on all DPS champions 2 columns behind her, so usually you can place it on most if not all of them. Anytime you're removing a DPS from an Artemis formation, you have to remember to consider not only the buff difference between the 2 champions, but the fact you're no longer getting the additional scaling from Observance by removing a DPS. The only reason Blooshi over Krydle is viable is because Krydle's buffing power is so low compared to the potential output of Blooshi. Blooshi is also great to slot because she is an evergreen champion and will have a steady flow of gear coming from chests. Another I want to talk about is Shandie, who is not a DPS, but is a double positional buffer. To start, she increases the damage of those within 2 slots of her based on how many dexterity 15+ champions are adjacent to her. So get her adjacent to those nimbly bimblers and within 2 slots of all of your DPS. But she also increases the damage of the column in front of her when your formation is under attack with Explosive Arrow. So if used in tandem with nerds, your damage will severely spike while your formation is under attack. But this also means you need her behind the column with the most DPS in it. Ideally Kent's column if you're using him where he is buffing everyone in that column. Then there is the more unique setup of potentially using Black Viper and or Arkhan. I've touched on this before, but the concept is to Omega buff a few select buffs and scale them up as hard as possible, giving it to Black Viper to scale with her Aura of Infamy, which can only be Rangers, Rogues, Warlocks, and Bards. Then have Arkhan usurp them, scaling it further. Then Artemis observes them, scaling it even further, while it's all being increased by Socialite. This can provide some very hefty numbers, but you have to be careful. You're losing out on a ton of potential buffing along that path, as Black Viper and Arkhan provide nothing other than that scaling. This requires you to specifically focus on that setup, and honestly, with Artie already being so restrictive, just adds another layer of that restrictive nature. Warning! You are about to enter the spoiler zone. It's just going to be a quick little stop, but I'll put text on the screen so you know when I'm done with the spoilies. For now, just cover your ears and go la 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 if you don't want to hear it, and wait until you see the spoiler text go away. The next season is going to feature some of the heroes of Baldur's Gate. I wouldn't bring this up, except it includes 2 champions we've talked about, Krydle and Shandie. I'll do a full breakdown of the season when it launches with all of the actual changes. And while we do have an idea of what's coming, we won't know for certain until it's actually released. But it is likely they won't work as well with Artemis after the changes, but we'll see. Honestly, any variation of Artemis works quite well. As long as you are using any combination of the champions that synergize with him, after you've invested in Artie, he will start taking off. But that is an important distinction. He needs that investment. And you need to invest in your chosen supports for him. But at the end of the day, you're going to be doing that anyway for whatever DPS you land on. A common formula for people as far as investing blacksmithing contracts is keeping his supports at roughly 10% his item level. But if you happen to be using Valentine as well, try to keep her more in line with where you have Artemis. A common goal for late game is to get Artemis to 10,000 item level, and his supports at 1,000. This is a very hardy goal for early to mid-game players, so believe me, I'm in no way, shape, or form saying this is required whatsoever. It's just often a goal to set your eyes on. And there are many people who have soared way beyond that. And even while Artemis is the top dog right now, that doesn't mean that's who you should lock your eyes on. Plenty of other DPS perform well, and once you've played long enough, you can utilize even the weakest DPS for every challenge they can face. Attach yourself to whatever draws you in. And if you've made it this far, thanks for choosing to spend your time here. Let me know in the comments who or what you want me to focus on in the future as far as formations go. And stay tuned for War Duke, releasing on November 30th, who I will be covering shortly after his release. Have a hell of a time out there, champion.